Welcome to this bonus edition of the Classical Top 5 and another in my series of conversations with figures in the music world who helped shape my life and career. This week it's Sir George Benjamin, one of the UK's foremost composers, a devoted student of Olivier Messiaen as a teenager. He burst onto the scene aged just 20 when his piece Ringed by the Flat Horizon was performed at the Proms. That was just over 40 years ago, and his major works have been regulars in the repertoire of soloists, chambered groups and orchestras everywhere ever since, perhaps none more so than his first full-length opera, Written on Skin, an instant hit in 2012 that's been hailed as his masterpiece. Now, I first met George 38 years ago when I was at school, and he visited us as part of a project run by the London Sinfonietta in the very early days of those pioneering education projects by orchestras. It seems extraordinary to think that he was only 23 at the time, having achieved so much already. We've remained friends ever since, and this conversation was recorded at his home in 2018. This is the first time it's been released. It's a very wide-ranging discussion about music, its joy and wonder, the role and job of the composer today, his studies with Messiaen, classical music on television and so much more. And it includes a deeply personal tribute to his close friend and fellow composer Olivier Messiaen, who had died just a few weeks before we recorded this conversation. And it is a conversation rather than an interview. A real privilege to be able to sit down with such a great artist and talk about our musical experiences, starting with that first time we met all those years ago.
We came down to your school, that we being the Sinfonietta, Gillian Moore, I think,
Yes,
myself and various players, and I remember doing a project, and I do remember meeting you then. I'm wondering whether, and I did wonder that all the efforts we did, and I did a huge amount during the 80s of educational work, what impact it had, and whether it left any form of lasting impact, and whether it introduced and opened up the world of not only classical music but modern classical music to kids, and I wondered, did it stay with them during their adulthood in any way? In other words, did it contribute to the musical culture and to people's lives in a lasting way? Now, with you, I think it did make an impact of some sort. Huge. Or were you already a big, heavy, what I would call muso, before we arrived?
I was. I mean, the context, I think, is that I was at a school called the Cornwallis School, which was a middle school. Kent was doing 13 plus at this point. So instead of being split out into grammar schools and everything else at 11, we had this sort of holding pen of school for about 2 years in the middle. And Cornwallis was actually a very creative school. It had a very lively music department in those days.
You were how old?
So 12 and 13. Yeah. And so they were always up for projects and new things. And of course, the Sinfonietta project came. I mean, this was a very early London Sinfonietta project, wasn't it? I think it was 1983.
Yes, very early then.
And the project was around your piece At First Light.
Oh, it wasn't Varese or Messiaen, which I remember doing.
It was At First Light.
Oh. Well, if it was At First Light, it could have been...
it was very fresh.
It could have been... Did you hear the music?
Yes.
Oh, because so 82 was the premiere.
Done.
Okay.
Yeah, it had already been done, and we had the recording. But what I do remember is the box of scores arriving, because we'd already started the project by then, and the project was based around, because obviously the piece is based on a painting by Turner, so it was perfect for us because we could take the painting and do our own projects around it, but taking on board the things that you'd done in your piece. But when the scores arrived, they were very fresh, I think, from Faber.
Yes.
And it was quite exciting to get them.
And they were beautifully published, actually.
Beautifully done, with the painting on the front page, wasn't it? And the thing I remember about it was because I had a relatively unusual upbringing in that contemporary music was always there from the very beginning because of my parents. I already knew about you, and I already knew about Ringed by the Flat Horizon, which was the piece you had done at the Proms, of course, in 1980. Which of course had also got a lot of people talking because you were so young. You were 20, weren't you then? So I already knew about that. And I knew about you, and I think I'd probably even heard At First Light, maybe even before the project. So I was sort of extra excited, if you like, about the project. But then no one else in the class did. Mm-hmm. And the other thing about it was I think there were a couple of us in the class who were musicians, but most of them, of course, weren't. And in a way, I think that's who the project was for.
The term is civilians.
Right, exactly. That's a nice way of putting it. But I think what I found interesting, what I remember about it, was that because of the way the project was done, I mean, it was the perfect piece for us in the sense that it was a story that we could tell through the painting itself and react to some of the things we saw in the painting. but it was also the way in which the project was actually done through the Sinfonietta and through Gillian, of course, who was such a pioneer in this area. We were never, ever patronised. It was never thought that we would need to relate to it in some way that to do with something that we had music around us. Like a lot of people, I think, feel like they need to now. Oh, this is a bit like something that you're familiar with. It was never like that. Yes. It was, this is the music and this is how it exists. Now go in and explore it. And
children, I remember as a child hating to be patronised and hating children's music normally.
Yes.
Because I don't want little dinky folk tunes to tap my feet to or recorder melodies. I want huge, great big symphonies with vast tam-tams.
Yes.
So, but what you say, in a way, disappoints me, Tommy, because it means you already indoctrinated before we came.
Well, yes, but it's slightly unusual. But what I would say is the impact of it was absolutely enormous.
I believe practice of music, listening to music, going to hear music, participating in music, writing music is a fantastic thing for children to do. It makes them sociable, it teaches them about history, it makes them aware of their senses, makes them aware of their hands, it teaches them to... It's fantastic for their minds, for their ears, in every way. Tell me, these friends of yours, some of you keep in contact with, so they may have enjoyed the project, and I'm not asking they become sort of wild contemporary music fans until the end of their days.
No.
But did it contribute something not superficial, not temporary, to their lives? Either have they remained interested in music, or it felt like it gave them something to do with their personal confidence, or is there anything that you can tell me? Because I wonder, you're about the only person that of all the education projects that I know who I still know, and I wondered, sometimes it occurred to me, are we not wasting time? And it may be enjoyable, but in fact it's not making a big difference.
I think it made a huge difference. I think, as you say, it probably wasn't musical in that sense. It was more about expanding the mind and appreciating things. I think if you're not open to things, you never appreciate them. And even if you just do it in a tiny bit, I mean, it's what they often say about concerts, isn't it? If you go to one, as you know, I host quite a lot of film music concerts. And often what people say is, well, if we can get them into those, and a lot of the audience that I hear from through Twitter and others, it's their first time they've ever heard an orchestra in the flesh, and it's a great moment for them. Well, it might be that it takes them 10 years or so to go to something else other than a film music concert, but it's sown the seed, and that's important. I think that's the same with
many people would say, oh, that's not the way into classical music, and say what a superficial and ridiculous way to attract people, and I would absolutely disagree, because my way, the thing that I devoted my life to, classical music, I found my way into it through the cinema, by going to see 2001, and by going to see Fantasia when I was a tiny child, 7, 8 years old. So
now, you know what I find fascinating about that is that those two films now, it's almost as if people are a bit snobby about the idea that classical people could possibly have first discovered it through something as rampantly commercial as cinema.
But they would be snobby about that 50 years ago.
Yeah.
They would have been snobby. The thing is, but if I might say, despite it being commercial but not making a great amount of money for Disney, it was the person behind it was Stokowski, and there was a true, genuine desire to democratically open up the world of classical music to children, and it worked. Yes. And it worked for me. It made me a musician. And as for 2001, we're talking about the work of one of the greatest, if not the greatest director of cinema, who also, amongst his numerous talents, had the most phenomenal, extraordinary and unique understanding of music. Yeah. He's, of all film directors, he's the one who's used it the best. So they're very exceptional films.
Well, and if you don't get affected by the opening scenes with Alzo Sprack, Zarathustra,
and the Strauss
there
Waltz as well.
Must be something wrong with you if you don't get excited by that.
But
moment.
the Ligeti also towards the end. I mean, what is this? A mysterious noise.
Well, and actually in The Shining as well, where he uses a lot of Penderecki's music. What I always find interesting about the use of that music is that, of course, we've got a lot of people who go and see those movies who wouldn't dream of hearing that music in a concert hall, going to see it in a concert hall, and yet they don't think really anything of it when it's in the context of a film.
Well, we used to say that 30 years ago. In other words, there was a sort of problem about modern music, and The only one of the ways that show wasn't completely unpalatable is that you go to Hammer horror movies and see some post-Schoenbergian expressionism and people would tolerate it. My feeling now has changed about that the great music, and of Ligeti is amongst the very greatest of recent composers, the problem seems to have gone away to me. People seem open to it and respond to it with emotion, as it should be the case. And it doesn't need cinema in a way to help it. The thing that's remarkable about Kubrick is that he was using, in fact both films, that Kubrick was using the Ligeti Requiem in 2001, 3 years after it was premiered in Stockholm. Yeah. It's astonishing. And to devote about 15% of Fantasia to the Rite of Spring in the mid-30s, that also was just about 20 years after its premiere. These directors and these films were incredibly audacious. Yeah. Incredibly audacious.
Talking of film, you've done your share of silent movie accompanying, haven't you?
I have. And not going to do it again. I did one in Amsterdam. I was composer in residence at the Holland Festival, and they did my two big operas there. It was a thrilling month there, and as a sort of the director, Ruth Mackenzie, who I like very much, asked me, "I've heard you've done these movies, and we really would like you to do one." And I said, "No, please, I haven't done them for years," and she persuaded me. So I did one. I did a very, very good film. The director was, I think, was it Fritz Lang? I can't remember. But I didn't enjoy doing it. I wasn't satisfied with what I was able to make. And that's been my general feeling in the last 10, 15 years, that I've lost interest. And I don't like I'm not interested in improvisation anymore. Mm. The last one that was good that I did was sort of like 15 years ago in Lyon, where I did Pabst's Lulu, Pandora's Box. And it's a marvellous film. And I always thought it was the best silent film I'd ever accompanied. I must have done 50, particularly in my student days. And on this occasion, I was in a huge concert hall, 2,000 people, and it was full, amazingly. And the screen seemed 100 foot high. It was enormous. And the piano seemed 150 foot long. It was gigantic and magnificent instrument, the best I've ever played. And somehow I was inspired that night. And I also wasn't using the film, making music that was sort of illustrative. I was using a more critical, slightly more distanced approach musically, and just it went right. And actually, towards the end, as the film was, the last 20 minutes, rather than milking the death of Lulu and the murders of, what's his name, that terrible, famous killer in Victorian London, Jack the Ripper, I began to just, silence has got longer and longer, the music got calmer and calmer and more distance. And actually I found, I think, just one chord in that improvisation, which I actually used in a real piece. It's the only time. So that was a really happy experience. The happiest ones were when I was a student at Cambridge, and there was a film society, and I was used to accompany movies there. And then I was really into improvisation, and so I had quite a lot of excitement then.
But it's such a contrast, that improvising in that moment and reacting to what you see in that moment. Such a contrast from what you're so famous for, which is poring over every single note. Yeah. And it's almost painful to produce those notes.
Funny, isn't it? The only thing I'll say is that improvisation is not composition. Composition involves architecture. It exists in the concept of a piece, in a funny way, exists outside of time. It is an object, like a building is an object. Improvisation for a film is in real time, spontaneity, without time for reflection, without any time for preconceived ideas. And it's entirely different. They're related, but it's very, very different. A piece of music has to survive. It has to have internal coherence. It has to have logic. It has to have a language. You can't ask that really of an improvisation, not in the same way. My pieces aim to have the spontaneity, of improvisation a lot of the time. But to produce that in an orchestra, when everybody has to have an individual part that's well-shaped and logical, and we're talking about maybe 100 people some of the time, that's not possible to improvise. And you can hear it. When a piece of music is composed in an improvisatory way, you can hear its amateurism very quickly.
I suppose the equivalent in my business is that you work really hard on your ad-libs, you know? And a bit like Eric Morecambe, of Morecambe and Wise, all the things that you think are spontaneous, and they thought up, they worked on all week to make it look as though it was spontaneous.
Chinese scroll making, where they have sometimes enormous brushes with very watery ink, and they can, in Japanese similar style, they can make a... I have a fish. He's down at the end of the... I bought that when my first trip to China. You can just see it there at the back, on the left. That must have taken... It could have been done, if I should show it to you later, it could have been done in under 5 minutes, but 50 years work went into having the skill to be able to attack the canvas in such a spontaneous way. But canvases are not the same as music. Music, unfortunately, you can't splash and get an art form. It just doesn't work. Music is very, very detailed. To write it down, notate it, it's very, very detailed, very complex organism to come to work with.
Just going back to the education project.
Yes, I want to. Yes.
When we first met, the thing that inspired... I left that whole experience totally inspired, and I would go home and immediately start writing music. And I know other friends in other schools who also had the benefit of Sinfonietta and London Voices as well, projects, who did exactly the same thing. They were really inspired by it. And I have tried to think quite a lot about what it was about it that inspired them. And I do think it was about being given the space to create around something. It was pitched right.
I learnt a very, very important lesson from my education projects with kids in the 80s. A very important lesson, which has grown in importance for me over the years, really, and continues to grow and make me think. I remember that when we got the children to improvise and to try and evoke some aspect of the pieces we were taking to them, regardless of the composer, and try to involve them, and when we just gave them like a very simple idea of try to make a sound of a castle with a sun over it, which is the Turner painting, and make pretty sounds that suggest dawn, that the results would be utterly generic and would be the same from one school to the next. And when you challenge children, or indeed anybody, to solve a problem or to have some form of restriction or some form of limited material within which they should work, some sort of frame, suddenly the results became more focused, more interesting. And also, these, as it were, constraints have to be expressed and have to be of the simplest kind that you could explain to a 4-year-old. And so I learnt that constraints, not just pure improvisation in a vacuum, are really useful, and those constraints have got to be extremely simple and clear, and then suddenly people's imaginations are provoked and liberated. And that's a lesson that a piece like At First Light, my early pieces were very, very intuitive indeed, and I was very hostile to the idea of any form of frame or any form of device that actually would be objective and underpin the music. And my philosophy and approach to that has radically changed over the years. And that's allowed me now to be much more fertile as a composer, write much more music, and maybe improve the quality of that music. But I began to learn that by working with kids in the 80s. So that was really, really important for me,
I still love At First Light, I mean, just as a piece, but because it kind of got inside me, if you like, during that process.
Yes.
in the education project, because it is a different way of learning a piece in the sense that you do your own version of it.
Yes.
Yes. And then, as it were, work backwards back to your piece and how you.
Yes. But when did I ask you to make dawn sounds, or did I talk about chords?
I think you talked about chords. I mean, one of the things I think I responded to most in the piece was the colour.
Colour, yes.
Because obviously you've got the colour in the painting.
Yes.
But the colour palette that you're using in the music, I found really.
Did I mention some of the things which were not entirely, were far from random, that I did to make the music sound in the way that it does?
Yes, I think you did. I mean, it's a long time. It was 35 years ago. I think, I think you did.
Yes, it is. God.
I mean, I remember one specific thing, which was that there's a moment where there's a rising figure right up to the top note of the piccolo, and it goes through the instruments up, and so it's not just one instrument that takes you on that.
It's not the very end of the piece.
It's near. No, not quite. It's the end of a movement, I think.
Is it the very end of the first movement?
Yes, I
it's a
think
huge
it is.
Sort of
streak
of the piccolo. Yeah.
And how you do that, how you overlap the instruments into each other so that it feels like one phrase, but actually it's across a number of different instruments. But yes. I remember that. I remember we discussed that. But again, it was more about, this is how one composer treats this painting, but how are you going to treat it? It was nicely done in that sense.
I'm well aware that creative subjects have been drained away from the core of the curriculum for kids. And I also was well aware of what happened to the educational system and instrumental teaching in the 80s and 90s. And the situation is not like it used to be, is it?
Most definitely not.
And
well, the real danger is that we lose a whole section of society who may well have musical talent, but are unable to see it through because they don't have the financial backing to do so. So a lot of the public schools have fabulous music departments and with great facilities, and a lot of the state schools do not. And the interest from those in power and those that have control over this is falling in the value of music. And this is why there's so many people now really trying. I mean, figures like Nick Daniel, the oboist, for example, really trying to lead a campaign to try and get people to be able to have the opportunity to learn instruments again. I mean, in my day, a lot of people who had problems financially were given instruments to be able to try them out, or at least later on, they could hire it at a very low rate, so they were subsidised. That is dropping off now, and that's the real danger. So when you conduct the National Youth Orchestra, of course, they're the best of the best. Of course, they are. But the worry is that the best of the best is only actually going to come from a fairly small pool eventually, and that you're not going to get some of those kids who showed real talent from a state school that might not have had much attention to it, but they haven't had the backing, they haven't been able to see it through.
One thing made me a little bit more optimistic, which is that the National Youth Orchestra used to be 90% public school, and now it's apparently 50%, 50-50. And I think it is still possible if you have a school in the right area with an inspiring and wonderful music teacher and a sensitive and intelligent and cultivated headmaster or headmistress, the things can still happen. It's not completely bleak across the world. But there is one thing. I've met over the years people who haven't known anything about classical music at all. And I won't say who she is, but quite a well-known comedian came to see me and wanted to play some classical music when she was on Desert Island Discs. But she didn't know what pieces. So she came for a few hours for a real sort of tutoring session with me, and I played her a whole series of gorgeous examples of less modern classical Baroque music. The emotional response from this person, goose pimples continuously. And this person whose life was completely without music, without at least classical music, if she had contact with it when young and had the right teachers, maybe parents who were open to it more as well, this life could have been enriched in an untold way by contact, by really in-depth contact. And I am certain there's millions of people who just haven't had the good for it's musical sensitivity and indeed musical talent is sprinkled like randomly over the population. It's got the greatest talents appear from nowhere. They can come from, like my beloved friend Ollie Knussen, from an extremely musical family, or they can come from a family which has had no contact with classical or any form of music at all. And the thing is, though, if you plant a seed in the desert and there's no fertilizer and there's no rain, it will die, and that's what the situation will be, that there will be people whose hearts and ears are utterly open without them knowing it to the joy, the wonder of music, and it will never happen in their lives because they're not having contact to it.
And it seems to me it's actually quite an exciting time for contemporary music right now. There's a lot of rather exciting young composers that have emerged and are now being very successful. A lot of female composers also coming to the fore and getting more opportunities and performances. But it takes me to the question of what the position, the modern composer has in today's society, given that a lot of the education now doesn't have music in it. What is the role of? How do you see your role as a composer?
This is contrary to the whole issue we're talking about. But I want to give you the example of France, where I've studied and where I have very profound contacts and which remain. They don't really teach music at school. And if you show musical talent, you go to a local conservatoire and you spend a huge amount of time. But for the general populace, as it were, that there's very little contact with music, and that shows that I don't think they have a youth orchestra which could rival the National Youth Orchestra, and I don't think they have the choirs that we have, which also play an extremely, really, I can't underline this, the Church of England choirs and the system across cathedrals is a fantastic resource in terms of maintaining our British musical culture. But so their music education has always been pretty useless, I think, in comparison. And that means that in many ways that music is less integrated into the general world, but it doesn't stop them producing fantastic composers, having some marvellous performers and some very good orchestras as well. So if we're being selfish and just thinking about the future of music itself, I think this country is still doing very well. It's the question of spreading the word and allowing it to be spread the most democratic way possible. And the sort of thing that we had in the 60s, where everybody learnt music and it was obligatory and people participated in music. And this transformed this country's reputation across the world. But anyway, I'm not answering what is the role of the composer today. The role of the composer is very simple: to write beautiful new music, and that's all. If the person is gifted to be a communicator and an educator, maybe a conductor, even a public figure, then all fantastic. But if they're extremely shy, want to hide themselves in a corner, but produce masterpieces, wonderful music that changes, that reroutes the path of music and is original and authentic and beautiful, that's all that's needed. It really is. And I do think that it is very good for the state of music to have an active compositional life in the country, and we do have that here in the UK. We really do, and it's very varied, and there are lots of interesting creative figures and some very big names. And that is to have to have the feeling, at least in the musical world itself, how the musical world itself, that music is still alive and it's still being written. That's incredibly important. How much that gets out to the general populace, I know that, say, the proms are incredibly important, and the televising of the proms is incredibly important. When I was in my teenage years and when I was in my 20s, I would also see films about composers regularly on television. The most important living composers: Messiaen, Boulez, Ligeti, Berlioz, Anarchis, Maxwell Davis, Birtwistle, Tippett, Walton, Britten, etc. And this was wonderful, fantastic, and that has just stopped. I'm all the more painfully aware that has stopped, because there is actually going to be, in a month's time, there's an Imagine programme which is going to be devoted to my work. And this is in the UK. This is the second film made about my work. The first one was in 1987. And this one is 30 years later.
I remember that one in 1987.
30 years later, but I've seen this century a programme devoted to Boulez when he died. There's been one about Errol Pert. There was one for my lovely great friend Ollie when he was 50. There was one on Maxwell Davis. I'm sure there's been one on Birtwistle, but they're very rare now.
Do you remember, I have a distinct memory of a programme that was on ITV, which I think makes it even more extraordinary. And it was a discussion, you were on it, it was a discussion about what is modern music, and it was a comparison between a piece by Robin Holloway and a Nick Moore piece called Odyssey, I think, which was this huge canvas. And it was a discussion between composers and performers about what makes modern music. Good Lord, that would never happen now.
Was it a South Bank show?
I don't think it was, actually. I may be wrong about that.
But on ITV, there were marvellous documentaries made about Stravinsky, about Britten, about Walton, about Messiaen, about Tippett. fantastic films. And to show honour to these creative figures,
Yes.
these films weren't 45 minutes, they were an hour and 3/4. They were huge things, sometimes 2 films over successive weekends.
Visibility is important. Like you were saying, the proms on television are important. If
Very.
they're there, people might come across them, even if they're
Yes.
not specifically thinking, I'm going to watch that.
I
Just
remember proms
accidentally come across
that
it.
I pinched things from a prom that I heard when I was 16 in my violin sonata that I wrote the following year. And I remember watching, and Boulez was on the television frequently.
Yes.
I heard his music. I heard so much music. It did make classical music. Funnily enough, the audiences are bigger now for contemporary music and for classical music. They really are.
Yes.
And it's strange. It's strange that there was much more media attention then, but actually the system seems in some ways healthier now.
Well, you look at a piece like Gruppen,
Yes.
Stockhausen. That was done recently a number of times by the LSO and Simon Rattle and other two other conductors. And of course, it's become really it's become one of those pieces. It's an event piece. Everybody goes to it. Everyone talks about what a masterpiece it is and everything. I'm sure I remember in my early years, if we went to a piece like that, there'd be all the same people there that were there the last time you heard it. And often, like with the Sinfonietta concerts at the Queen Elizabeth Hall, one of the charms of it almost was it was like a little club.
Yes.
Where all the same people went to it. Now that actually isn't the case. There's a huge audience for,
No.
and they pack it out with Gruppen now, which is amazing.
I'm aware of this, and the concerts I've been to just this year, or have participated in myself with modern music in the programme. The audiences are huge, but there's a but there, just within the musical framework, which is there's Gruppen, there's Boulez's Notation, there's Ligeti's Lontano and Atmosphere, there's Triangolina by Messiaen, maybe Was Exotic by Messiaen, there's Berrios Symphonia, but I'm listing under a dozen pieces that have actually entered the repertoire and been forced there by brave conductors and managements, and now are sort of entering there. I am frankly disappointed that aren't more regularly played across the world. And I'm also somewhat disappointed that a lot of conductors and a lot of managements also aren't feeling that they have a responsibility to move the art of music on and to integrate contemporary, or what was contemporary music but now is 50 years, 60 years old.
Yes.
And to actually shift the repertoire. There's plenty of pieces that are regularly played in the repertoire all over the world all the time that could very happily be lost, in my view, that aren't the greatest music and could disappear. And I would like to... And Mahler, who I adore and always have loved as a composer, but he's overplayed, and Shostakovich is overplayed. And so there's the repertoire, and those responsible for making the repertoire have disappointed me in some ways. I would like to see that the greatest works of the 20th century were established in the repertoire across the world and were played with greater frequency than they are.
I went to see the Los Angeles Philharmonic with Dudamel conducting at the Barbican at their recent residency.
Yes.
And they did a concert where, in amongst other pieces, there was a new piece and there was Varese. And goodness, the Varese sounded like the most modern piece.
Yes.
And
yes.
it's 100 years old.
Yes, Varese is almost 100 years old. Well, Varese is a very extraordinary figure. Very, very extraordinary figure. I suppose Amérique has entered the pantheon. I suppose his pieces have, but they do still, and they will always remain reverberative and shocking because they're very, very. The orchestra for Amérique is gigantic, and it's bigger than the Rite of Spring, and it's even noisier than the Rite of Spring. It does, incidentally, owe Stravinsky a huge amount. It's not as original in epoch making as Stravinsky, but it's a marvellous music. There's his later Varese. There's a few pieces, Hyperprism, Intégrale, for ensemble without strings, brass, wind and percussion, which are the pure, real Varese. And they are really, really more original and more remarkable.
But if it's still surprising us and still shocking us, still getting us stirred up. I think it will. Just like Schoenberg, some of Schoenberg's music is still disturbing and really quite uncomfortable to listen to. I'm not sure that will change. I mean, I heard a wonderful performance from the Proms on the radio of Beethoven 7 with the Berlin Philharmonic with their new chief conductor, and
the effect that music had on me as a little child was duplicated.
Yeah.
I felt I was almost flying towards the end of the finale.
Yes.
It's just indescribable the effect that music has to me, and my wonder at its greatness. It's just extraordinary. And I think it had the same almost levitating effect on audiences in Beethoven's own day. So some things are very shocking because they're new and they're unheard of, and they break strongly established cultural conventions, which in our day are much weaker than they used to be. Much, much weaker. They've broken down. And in the way that people live and the way that people approach the arts has tremendous liberty today, something which I like very much. But the truth, if the music is played honestly and well in its own time, the truth of the music gets across and in some ways doesn't change. So the thrill of the Rite of Spring, and its gnashing chords and its tremendous exuberance and rhythmic vitality, that still is the same. It still is the same, and the beauty, interior beauty, and mysteriousness and sensuality of Debussy's music will remain the same.
I first discovered the Rite of Spring because my mum had the Igor Markovich recording, I think with the Philharmonia.
He did that piece very, very well.
And it's amazing.
There's a YouTube, I think, recording of him conducting it in Japan. It's very impressive.
But I loved the violence of it,
course.
and of course I did.
It's a music made for 10-year-olds, you know.
But it's still doing it.
Of course.
So still
of course.
conductors are coming along and doing... I remember when Gergiev started doing it, and it was like he was shaking the piece out of orchestras now find it pretty easy to play.
Yes, they do.
And it sounds like it.
Yes.
And he would shake it up a little bit, make it sound dangerous again. You were on the edge of your seat in the hall.
Messiaen used to say that you need every decade to transpose the opening bassoon solo up a semitone, because in its first day, it was meant to be almost unplayable and would not have sounded the suave and cantabile, beautiful, melodious thing that it is today, sounding comfortable and a bit strange, because the top of the bassoon is a bit strange, wonderfully strange, but it's comfortable and lyrical, and it would have sounded like a strangled swan when it was first played. There is, I don't know if it's true, the story of Saint-Saëns, who must have been in his 70s or 80s then, was a very old man. He'd been born in the 1830s. He outlived Debussy. So he had a very, very long life. There's a story of him attending the first night and walking out in bar 15 saying, "You cannot treat a bassoon like that." So it should sound a bit raucous and a bit strained. Not like it's played today, yes.
Talking of Messiaen, and you mentioned the Turangalila Symphony it is absolutely
it's core
secure in the core repertoire, isn't it? And again, quite extraordinary, really, because on Spotify now you can hear Bernstein rehearsing for the premiere.
I knew there was a recording.
It's amazing, because this is an orchestra playing it for absolutely the first time. I've never seen it before.
And I knew that Koussevitzky gave a radio speech on the day of the premiere saying to people, "This is an extraordinary work, please come and listen to it. It's entirely original, but it's unlike anything else." A most marvellous, moving speech.
But really hard for the players, that's the point.
Yes.
Now it doesn't seem...
No, it was hard for players initially. Now it's not that hard at all. It needs a lot of stamina. But thing about I'd be fascinated to hear. I didn't know that was out there because Bernstein didn't like the piece. No, unfortunately.
But as a professional and as a conductor, this is a piece.
And a very ambitious young man. He very ambitious young man.
Because in a way, it kind of suits him, that piece.
Well, that's what's so strange about it. Someone told me that he was, or did I read this? That he was asked why he didn't like it. He said, "Oh, it's coffee table music," and I think that's a bit rich coming from Bernstein.
But one of the most inspiring days of my life was in 1987 when Messiaen was the composer in focus at the Royal Academy of Music.
Yes, I remember that.
And the Royal Academy of Music Orchestra played Turangalila.
John Carew conducted.
John Carew conducted. Yvonne Loriot was
playing
the piano. Tristan Muraille was playing the on Martineau, and of course Messiaen was in the audience.
Yes.
Now I brought my score with me
in the Duke's Hall. Yeah.
I brought my score with me, which I borrowed from the library. I often tell this story, but I borrowed the score from the library. After the concert, you probably don't remember, but you introduced me to Messiaen at the end, and it was just the three of us in the room, and he signed the score in the front. I then took the score back to my library in Maidstone. There was this wonderful, wonderful head of music in a library. Remember when libraries had heads of music? And she's called Frances, and she was a huge fan of contemporary music. And she said, I can't have this back. You must have this score. We'll buy another one. And so I've still got that score with his signature in it, of course, and it's one of my treasured possessions. But what an extraordinary
God, what
gesture.
an amazing thing to do.
And
another person said, you've got to give it back and then take it, then
absolutely,
keep it.
we'll have this one. No,
sweet thing to
she
do.
knew the value of it, absolutely.
No,
but what I found most extraordinary about that performance, of course, was that there, laid out in front of us, was almost the reason music exists. You had this piece written by that man who's sitting over there, who'd written it for that woman up on the stage who's playing the piano part, even though it was unrequited. And this extraordinary outpouring of love in this 80-minute piece. And we were experiencing it right there, front and centre.
In a small hall.
Yeah, played by young, extraordinarily good, but young musicians.
Absolutely, and the only room for about 500, 600 people.
It was incredible.
So it was very loud.
It was very loud. And of course, a lot of the people who were in that performance, I know, because I went to the Academy 2 years later, and they all remember it.
That's
like
not something they're going to forget in their whole lives. No.
But it was the creator and the performer in the same room together, but in a way that's pretty unusual. It has to be said.
Of course. Well, how many Messiaens in a century are there?
Yes.
What was wonderful for me was that when I went over to study with him in Paris in 1976, is that his relationship with this country was quite limited, quite small. And he's had few pupils. Well, he's had some important pupils, including my future teacher, wonderful future teacher, Alexander Goer. But partially through my efforts, I have to say that this is true. I really, really worked hard on his profile, or not his profile, but getting his music played a lot here. And he actually came to the UK on his 80th birthday to hear his opera, St. Francis. And that, I think, I deserve no thanks for this at all, but I think it was my idea. And the LPO performed it, and it was an amazing, extraordinary event. But I'd had at least some small role. But what I was very pleased about is that in those 80th birthday celebrations, that he said to say thank you to everybody the next day after the Quartet for the End of Time was played in the Queen's Hall. He took a microphone and he said, I've been so moved to be here, and I'm so grateful for this country's wonderful musical life and what it's done for my music and the fact that I feel understood here. This is the land of music, he said. And the great and marvellous and extraordinary Pierre Boulez was standing next to the microphone, and under his breath he said, "Non, il faut pas dire ça, no, you cannot say that." And I remember Messiaen saying, "Non, mais je vais le dire." No, but I will say it. So in other words, the UK became really his, he felt, and the reason I'm saying that is that his music was loved here in a deep way and understood, and he was revered in a way more than in France, I think more than in Germany, more than in many countries. Perhaps only in Japan was his music also treated in such a way. So for this evening at the Royal Academy of Music, the audience would probably have been huge fans.
You must get a lot of satisfaction from hearing young people play your music, as much as the greatest players play it.
I wouldn't make that easy that comparison.
As soon as I said it, I realised
because I did the proms and on tour with the NYO, one of my own works, Dance Figures, and I was astonished how the National Youth Orchestra played. And I was able to take perhaps I haven't conducted for 10 years, so I made some progress as a conductor, so I was able to conduct it a bit better. But the finale only works, the last of 9 movements, short movements, only works if it's taken at an insanely fast speed and if it's played with the right dynamics. And I never had achieved that in the performances I've done until working with the National Youth Orchestra. And I was astonished by their capacity to play, how well they'd been coached before my arrival, and as well the attitude is so moving of these people, young people with their enthusiasm, lack of any cynicism and bright-eyed sort of desire to make music. Yes. It was completely enthralling for me. To go back to the Royal Academy, I remember a rather touching a conversation I had with Messiaen at a quiet moment before one of the concerts, but perhaps before Taranglina. I remember saying to him, either how does it feel to sort of hear all your pieces, so many of your pieces from your life, one after the other, day after day, or how wonderful it must be to do that. And he said, I'm not sure. Hearing all my pieces, it fills me also with shame that the things that could have been better and that I didn't realise as well as I'd like. So
all artists are like that, though, aren't they? Really?
No, some are so certain in their genius, whether it's realised or not. Or Wagner would not have said something like that. And I don't think Strauss would have said something like that.
No.
Many would, most would, if they're honest. Yes.
Do you?
Yes.
Because I always have this image, because, as we were saying before, you're famous for spending a lot of time on music and poring over it. I often wonder, you've spent so much time on that note that actually there is nowhere else to go because you've made that decision eventually. And that once you're in performance, there isn't nowhere else to go.
That's slightly the wrong image. It's not that I deliberate and usually for years on the next note, though occasionally there can be a note that's difficult to find. No, we touched on this when we were talking about improvisation, is that actually the thing that takes the time is finding the language, finding the architecture, finding the expressive and technical world. Music is a thing which doesn't, people think you sort of sit at the piano with a bottle of champagne on one side and you just improvise, sort of inspiration comes and you just quickly write it down, or that you've got the whole sound of the piece in your head already and then you just try to notate it well. It's not like that. Composing is work. It's working with material. And a piece of music, particularly today, needs some form of integrity, some form of coherence, and needs, particularly when it's polyphonic, many-voiced, and that's very complex. Believe me, it's really complex. You need to find a way to write. Each piece is a new challenge. So once the music is going, I write really fast sometimes. But to get into the position where I can write the music and write it fast takes me a lot of time. But one can work on very, very assiduously and at great length on a terrain which isn't very good. And so there's numerous pieces of mine that I would really like them to disappear. Not all of them, fortunately. But equally...
Well, how do you feel about Ring by the Flat Horizon now?
Okay.
Because it was a long time ago. You were
Yes.
19, presumably, when you wrote it.
Yeah.
It got a lot of attention at the time, obviously, because it was done at the proms. How do you feel about that piece
It
now?
still gets played. On rare occasions, every 5 years when I conduct it, I can sometimes have a thrill, particularly if I'm working with a really good orchestra. But it's not how I would write music today. And if I want me to give it, perhaps I won't. But I do things differently now, and I prefer the way I see things now. But equally, I'm going to start composing, having had some rest, conducting rest, and not real rest. But I've been away from my compositional table for quite a long time now, because after writing a big opera, Lessons in Love and Violence, which was premiered in May at the Royal Opera House, my tank is empty, my batteries are low, so I need to take some time off, get some new musical experiences, and I've been here and there conducting and having an exciting time doing that. But I've got the urge now, quite a strong urge, that I want to write again now. And what I'm feeling when it's an inchoate sort of sensation within me, I can't describe it very precisely, but that vague feeling, something deep down that's not rational, is actually where the writing of music in the end comes from. And I can feel a type of music and a type of invention and indeed expressive mood and type of sound world that I haven't written before and that I really would like to do. And in a way, it's a reaction to what I've been writing in the last few years. So I think one should be really, in the end, grateful for those potentially unpleasant feelings of I'm not satisfied. I haven't done exactly what I want. I want to do something different, because it's creativity that comes from that. Otherwise, you would just go around in circles or stop.
Do you ever get surprised by inspiration? I remember when I used to come to your flat for lessons, often the thing that inspired me was not, in a way, not the music, but all the other things we talked about as well. So painting and other composers, but also film and all sorts of things, whatever might be in the air at the time. And I was never quite sure what might inspire me when I got back home after being on the train to suddenly start writing. And of course, I mean, you can grab things from almost any aspect of life, can't you? And think that might inspire you. I know that, like, for example, Thunderclap has inspired you, and so on. Are you surprised sometimes by what? I mean, even if it's not something that then you take on as a proper basis for a piece, but things that trip things in your mind and you think that might work as an idea?
Only once in my day have I had an inspiration that was so strong that came in a flash, and that then became a piece. And that was with my early song piece for soprano and orchestra, Mind of Winter, where the sound world of the piece literally came to me in about a second, and that then became the piece. More and more I'm convinced, and it's the way I tend to do it, that you work at the stuff of music, which is so more interesting in the world, basically, which means line, melody, harmony, rhythm, timbre, form, structure. You work on things, and you work in quite an abstract way, and the thing that's nice is that suddenly this weird thing, improvisation, inspiration can come. You hope it does. When suddenly it's like a force that makes all these disparate thoughts come together, and it gives a mood and a feel to a piece, which creates unity for every aspect of it. And it's something which sustains you across the months or years of writing. But it's something which comes to you after you work. And it's not, as it were, inspiration, writing, performance. It's thinking, working, studying, trying out, and then suddenly the flame lights because of, as it were, because of your work. And then that type of what we might call inspiration can also come from painting, can come from nature, can come from life, can come from film, for me more and more from literature. And suddenly, but it's when it's not the starting point of the process. It's not usually, almost categorically not the starting point. It's something which comes along the route. It's really important, at least for me it's really important, but it's not something you can rely on.
What about performers? Because you've worked with a lot of performers a number of times, as I suppose as collaborators. Do they ever inspire you for the actual writing of the music?
The thing about being a composer is that particularly if you're a very self-critical one like I am, is that it's good as the years go by to learn the terrain, what helps you, what really helps you yourself, only you can find out, helps your psychology, helps your nature as a person, as a musician, to get going. So I have discovered that mucking around with very small pitch and rhythmical elements usually can get me going. Also writing for specific musicians or specific orchestras or specific singers is a real source of help as well. There's one thing which is slightly different, which I haven't mentioned, which is that writing an opera with a story and with a brilliant text, that is an incredible source of inspiration, of help to composing. I mean, really a major one, something which is quite new to me in the last 12, 13 years, and which has really increased my productivity fantastically. So you can also learn what things aren't useful, and you can begin. So I'm afraid one's given a mind and a body, and you have to learn how to cope with this and how to realise the best from it. Like a sports person, when to exercise, when not, when to rest, and they don't teach you at the conservatoire how to cope with yourself.
But a lot of composers, I know, it's almost like they're waiting for the singer or the musician to inhabit the music, to give it something else. So there's almost some space there within their writing for something else almost to emerge. And I've always imagined you as having such a clear idea in your mind as to exactly how things should be. I mean, I know that in the recent New Yorker article about you, Yestin Davis, for example, the countertenor, said about, sometimes with, I think it's triplets, singers can often take a little bit of liberty on those, and you often don't want that. You've written it that way for a very specific reason. Okay,
I've just been in Berlin conducting. I did a concert with the Philharmonic, and then I did my Into the Little Hill with the Mahler Chamber Orchestra as part of a sort of residency there. And two things were said to me. Someone I like very much in great respect said to me, "You have to understand, George, you are a control freak." And I'm afraid, I suspect that's inherited, and I can't do anything about that. At least not much. I like detail, and I'm as fascinated in detail as I am in big form. And if I write detail, it'd be nice if it's in the right place at the right time. Okay, so that's, I can't help, and I admit to that. Okay, but then I was working with a singer in Into Little Hill who also said that I was very picky in rehearsals, and that I do hear what's going on, and when a note is not right or rhythm is slightly squiffy, that I will ask for it to be put right. But in performance, in the actual performance itself, I give a lot of freedom to the musicians, potentially if they're musicians I know and trust. Maybe I don't give enough, but I give some. And also I want them to give of their own. So the first thing is, you get the text right. I mean, it's there for a reason. You get the notes in the right order, in the right place. Then in the performance, give of yourself. Bring new things, bring new attitude to it, bring emotion to it, bring spontaneity, bring drama, bring tone, bring human attributes, sarcasm if needed, or affection or threat. I love that aspect, and I in a way I notate my music more simply than I used to, in order to give the performers more right to inhabit the music and give more of themselves.
We must talk about, as we begin to wrap up, we must talk about your hit. I mean, it's a big hit, Written on Skin. Your opera is a big hit by any standards, been done all over. And it really captured something, didn't it? Why do you think this piece in particular seemed to really capture people's attention above all the other pieces that you've written?
Well, it's got a wonderful text by Martin Crimp. Those who sang in the world premiere in Aix-en-Provence, the singers, were sensational. And in the pit was the Mahler Chamber Orchestra, an orchestra to which I'm utterly devoted. And the sound they make is incomparable. It's just so beautiful, articulate, powerful, sensitive. I don't know. The hoo-ha after its premiere astonished me. And I'm thrilled and grateful that it's going to be done in China next month. And
I couldn't see it in its first run because it was sold out. Well, but I mean, it comes back to kind of what we were talking about before. The audience for contemporary opera. It's the same with Akhenaten, Philip Glass, which are going to do over and over again because it just sells out every time. It was the same with Birtwistle's operas as well. I mean, there is this extraordinary audience for contemporary opera.
Yes.
And yours
well, that's
really
that's not my doing. What Martin and I wanted to do was to tell a story in an active, dynamic story in a different, new way. And I think one of the things that may have helped us was the fact that we did, in a strange way, but tell a very direct story. A lot of contemporary opera is meditative opera, or ritualistic opera, or anti-narrative opera, or philosophical opera, and a lot of modern opera, for a long time, has been wary of narrative. That's one thing, maybe. Just as pure conjecture from me. Also, I do love the human voice, and I did try to write very lyrically within the reality of theatrical context. So it's far from lyrical all the way through. And maybe one thing that is different is the way that I integrated the vocal lines into the orchestra. A lot of contemporary music, it does seem there's some sort of rupture between the pit and the stage, and that the ear doesn't, and people may not be aware of this, but this was a very important thing for me, is that the ear integrates what's going on in the pit, in the orchestra, and what's going on stage. My theory, my imagination was that could create a more profound experience because, as it were, there was a fusion between instruments and singers. Otherwise, Tommy, I don't know. I did the very best I could. I've been waiting to write an opera for 30 years, and it took me decades to find the right collaborator and to find the right technique and have the confidence and the range to fill a whole evening.
I rather like the line in the New Yorker article that says, "Having begun as a wunderkind, he has become a late bloomer." I rather like that because in a way that's exactly right, isn't it? Because you were the next Benjamin Britten and so on and all that stuff.
I'm not the next Benjamin.
I mean, those were the kind of headlines that were created from the Proms performance in 1980,
yes.
And yet here you are actually, almost 40 years later, and you're having this extraordinary success in the theatre, in opera.
Well, it's something I was longing to do. The roots of my musical experiences were most important roots in some ways were the plays at school for which I wrote incidental music, which I conducted in performance after performance. It gave me the taste for the theatre. It let me hear my orchestration when I was a young kid. and it gave me a love for opera as well, which I regret that I didn't write any operas in the 80s and 90s. I did write pieces, and those pieces, I don't want to... There are some pieces, my piano piece Shadowlines, Palimpsest for orchestra, my duet for piano and orchestra, Viola. There's some pieces, not all of them, from the period between my extreme youth and my opera writing days, which I'm very proud of, and which are Three Inventions, say, or which are really part of my progress, and which if I hadn't written, I would not have been able to write a note of opera. But yes, it's quite nice to have had this shock at the age of in my 50s, suddenly to have entered the theatre and entered it in such a way. It's a big surprise, but I'm very, very grateful.
And, by the way, a knighthood.
Well, yes, I know.
What did that mean to you?
I'm extremely touched and feel it's a very great honour. Yes, of course. Very, very great honour. Huge thing, extraordinary thing. One regret is my parents, who would have been so thrilled.
Yes.
Sadly missed it by just a few years. My mum by 7 years, my dad by just 1 or 2 years. And it's amazing, and yet, in the end, my life is mainly spent alone in a room staring at empty paper. And all other thoughts, everything else, all this stuff about whether music's played and whether the audience comes and whether I get an honour or honours, and disappears entirely. And the only thing that matters is the work in hand. And I really do mean that is the case. I devote myself really to an extreme degree in writing the pieces that I write. And once I'm in them, once I'm inside them, the rest of the world almost doesn't exist. And we wouldn't be having this conversation during one of those periods.
Indeed. There's one last thing I want to ask you. I do want to ask you about Olivier Messiaen, because when he died suddenly, there was an extraordinary outpouring of love for that man and what he represented, not just as a person, but also in his music, but also in what he represented in the musical world. Because actually, I think what it showed is actually what a small family of British contemporary music can be. Everybody knows each other. And Ollie was always so much at the centre of things, it felt like, although not necessarily always physically. But I know he meant an enormous amount to you, of course. What do you think he meant to the world of music?
Well, he was a huge figure, gigantic person, but a gigantic and great musician. That is very simple, simply a great musician. But he was also a very private person. He didn't like the hoo-ha, and he was very media unfriendly.
Yes, I know that. I know this to my cost.
Okay. But for me as a friend, he was as close a friend as I will ever have in my life, and without question, my closest musical friend. We would talk most days. I had a quite long conversation with him the day before he died. And he was a person who meant an indescribably large amount to me. I loved Ollie very deeply. He was a fantastic friend. I can't really find the adjective to describe. He was more like a brother to me than a friend. And he was a wonderful support to me musically, and the most fascinating, knowledgeable mind. And he was also the naughtiest and funniest, wickedest sense of humour. I mean, we must have spent literally, if we count all the hours up, we must have spent about a year on the phone together. And a good 6 months must have been spent in hysterics laughing, because he was just so funny. He was just, I can't say what a wonderful person he was. And
what about as a composer? Because obviously one of the famous things about him was that he often struggled to finish pieces.
And start them also.
Yeah.
He had a really painful relationship with his muse for all sorts of reasons, for all sorts of quite interesting, complex, but also the nature of his personality. He also was very picky, like me, and I think he may have counted also as a control freak. And but what matters now is the fact that there are not a huge number of pieces, but the large majority of them are simply wonderful. And they're so beautifully composed, and they're so generous expressively, and so full of this wonderful, capricious, tender and imagination, so full of vitality, so superb as an orchestrator, such a wonderful ear, fantastic harmonic sensibility. It's a marvellous legacy that he leaves behind. But he was not only, of course, there was this moving outpouring of feeling from all over the place, not only in the UK, very much in America, but all over the world. But he was also extraordinarily generous as a person. He was so generous to me in so many ways, but he was so generous if he liked you to so many people. There almost isn't a major young composer in this country who didn't have a fantastic first or second or third performance under his auspices, under his fantastically brilliant, intelligent, focused baton, marvellous conductor. And he just was so, he really cared about helping his friends, conducting all sorts of music. The number of pieces, if you were to count up, he kept a book of all his concerts. And he did an awful lot of concerts. He's conducted 5 or 10 times more than I've done. And the sheer number of and diversity of music. I mean, I used to tease him. He started in the last few years of conducting Beethoven symphonies and Brahms symphonies here and there, and we would, on the phone, refer to... We had our own way of talking, a sort of language of our own, and I would refer to those as, the start of his Beethoven cycle, the start of his Brahms cycle, and we would joke about that. But he would conduct, and he conducted brilliantly these repertoire works, but the number of contemporary works and world premieres he conducted is just astonishing. And those that knew him, he didn't accept everybody into his life. And if he didn't like you, or something you did may upset him, then it was very clear and some friendships hit the rocks. And
is that not like a Benjamin Britten sort of
No,
approach?
not like that. No, he wasn't sensitive. Well, he was very, very sensitive. But he wouldn't discard people like that. But if they earned, as it were, if they were harsh to him or insensitive towards him, or if they were cruel to someone he loved, or was really, then he wouldn't forgive, almost not forgive. Do
you think you also maybe connected with him at a deeper level, perhaps because he also had a lot of attention very early on? His father obviously was principal bass of the London Sinfonietta Orchestra, and Ollie was able to have a few opportunities from that too. Had one of his, was it his symphony played by the LSO?
Yes.
Very early on. He was a teenager, wasn't he? I wonder whether there's that connection a little bit, because you know what it's like to have that kind of attention at a really, really early stage in your life.
There were many things that kept us together. We shared the same and wonderful publisher, Faber Music, throughout our lives. We were both conductors who composed. We loved movies. We loved comedy. There were all sorts of things that brought us together, and that could have also torn us apart. And in a way, we worked in our friendship, that allowing nothing to come between us. And I'm so happy that was the case. As for what you ask about, yes, there is that, but only up to a point. My burst of activity was smaller than his. It wasn't involving camera, sun and mirror newspaper photographers climbing up trees outside my bedroom to try and get a glimpse of me. It didn't involve me conducting a piece at Carnegie Hall when I was 20. And I was 20. In other words, I was a young adult when it happened. And I'd gone through my education. And I had the support of Messiaen, one of the great composers of our time, which underpinned and gave me, protected me in some ways from the hoo-ha. And if I was slower in the years that followed that, in the years that followed at first light, it's because I was not happy with my technique, and I was not contented with, in a way, the way I had been taught music, and had to start from scratch in some ways and find a technique that suited what I am as a person. And that took me 10 years or so. Difficult time, but it still kept me creative, except the odd blockage. Now with Ollie, he became this huge thing when he was 13 or 14, when he was still a kid, and a very sensitive kid. And the hype was much, much bigger. Television, popular press and a backlash from the established world of modern music in this country, which was quite vicious, to a degree that he had to escape and go and live in America for almost a decade. I think that was harder for him than, it was very hard for him. Apparently, when he came back into this country when he was about 25, they still didn't want to know about him, and it took the support of some very loyal friends who realised his genius to allow his music to gradually start to be taken seriously and his conducting to be admired. And then he became a vast figure, if not the central figure in the modern music world in this country. But and there's one other thing about my dear friend, is that he had a memory that was extraordinarily unable to forget. He remembered things as if they had happened yesterday and they were 40 years before. In the end, all of this is completely and utterly irrelevant. He gave more to this country and to the world of modern music than anybody else. He wrote a large quantity of masterpieces of music that I think will continue to be played, and he did inestimable good to the musical culture and to the world of composers of our own day. He did more than anybody else. So, in my view, he was the musical figure of our time in this country, and his loss is unbearably sad, because he would have been able to carry on doing fantastic things for decades. But what he realised in his life is enough for 10 lives, I think.
I think we all have people, don't we, who are absolutely key to our lives that we think back on as being inspiring. I mean, I have to say, George, sort of coming back to, the first time you came to our school, you are most definitely one of those to me. It did inspire me enormously. It made me write. And I wrote far more as a teenager than I did subsequently, of course. I sort of almost burnt myself out, I think. But it was an extraordinary moment for me. And that's why we're sitting here now, really, because, it's 35 years ago. So we've had our whole lives in between. But it's wonderful to talk to you, George. Thank you.
Great pleasure, Tommy.
Thank you so much.
No, not at all.
If you enjoyed the Classical Top 5, please do consider making a donation. Details are always in the summaries of each of our podcasts. And if you want to follow us on Twitter, we're at Classical Top 5. On Facebook, we have a page, The Classical Top 5. Just search for that. And if you'd like to email us, because we always like to hear from you, please do. classicaltop5@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.